Continuing the genetics chapter. Got a lot of genetics chapter to cover. There's two guys on a little island. I goes, I wouldn't worry. With continental drift, Africa or South America should come by eventually. Well, yeah, wait a few million years. But the continents do move around. That will come up in a couple of minutes. Once people got so that they kind of knew how genetics worked, they started to apply it all over the place. This is why if you're going to be a biology major, at some point early on, you have to take a full course in genetics, because it is the basis for an awful lot of stuff. And one of the things that they started to apply genetics to was evolution. Remember, the simple form of evolution is changes in a population over time. And what you wind up with is the average member of the population shifts over time, as especially with a changing environment, as it picks and chooses the good individuals and the not so useful individuals. The ones that are suited to the environment tend to survive and make more babies. The ones not so suited tend to not survive, not make so many babies. The big deal here is stop looking at the groups as populations and start looking at them as populations of different alleles, different gene variants that produce different proteins that produce the different features that selection is either selecting for or selecting against. And all of the genes, all of the alleles in a population are called the gene pool. So a population has a gene pool. It's all the alleles. There's so many of this allele and that allele of the same gene. And the ratios of this allele for that gene to that allele for that gene can shift over time. And that's really what's changing. Is an allele that produces a very useful protein, their carriers are going to survive and pass more of those alleles on to the next generation. The alleles where the carrier doesn't have an advantage, in fact has a disadvantage, they tend not to survive, not to pass them on. The ratio for that allele drops over time. May not disappear, but one allele gets more common, one allele gets less common. The average genetic makeup of the average individual changes. Connected to this is a weird situation called hybrid vigor. There are diseases that are genetic. Sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease. And in some populations, there's a decent number of alleles in the population. And a big question for evolution is, okay, if this is making a disease, if having the disease makes you less likely to survive, then why is this allele even around anymore? Or why is it, as common in a population as it is? And it turns out, it eventually took a while to figure this out. For a while they thought there's something called piggybacking, where a not so useful allele is so closely linked to a really useful allele that it kind of gets carried along from generation to generation. And they were figuring maybe that's what's going on. But this is what they found out. There are times when a bad allele isn't bad. Sickle cell anemia, for instance. In sickle cell anemia, the allele produces a type of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is your oxygen-carrying molecule in your red blood cells. The sickle cell allele produces a hemoglobin that can't stay round when oxygen comes off of it. It changes shape. A whole red blood cell full of them can actually change the shape of the blood cell, makes the cells like a sickle head. And cells like that jam up. They don't get through little blood vessels very well. It's a dangerous thing to have two alleles for. If all your alleles are making the sickle cell protein, then you're going to have major problems. But here's what they discovered. In areas of Africa where this originated, having one sickle cell allele, so only half of your hemoglobin will do this, and only when oxygen depleted, and one regular hemoglobin allele, gives you a survival advantage if you're infected with malaria. Malaria actually invades and reproduces in red blood cells. It depletes the oxygen there. And if your red blood cells are a mixture of the two hemoglobins, the cells with malaria in them crumple up, they're flagged as being worn out, your system recycles them, pulls them all apart, but it kills the malaria doing it. Hybrid vigor is where having one bad allele and one good allele together gives you an advantage over having both bad, that's bad, or both good. In this case, you're more likely to die of malaria. In the case of cystic fibrosis, you're more likely to die of complications from diarrheal diseases, which are very, very common in the world, is that they will deplete they'll dehydrate you, they'll make you weak, they'll make you prone to other things killing you. And cystic fibrosis, the gene is involved in moving water in and out of the mucus in your linings. Something like cholera pulls water out of you in order to give its offspring a survival advantage, because they got to spread through drinking water, and the wetter they can make your outflow, the longer their offspring can survive in the environment. One cystic fibrosis allele and one regular allele gives you more advantages over those diarrheal diseases than two regular alleles. Diarrheal disease is more likely to kill you. Or two cystic fibrosis alleles, cystic fibrosis is likely to kill you. So that was a way of saying, okay, this is how bad alleles wind up being more common in a gene pool, because they're not always bad. Another thing about evolution, any population or gene pool where reproduction continues to happen in the gene pool, then it's one big pool, is that the alleles kind of work for the entire mass. If for one reason or another a group gets isolated with its own separate gene pool, no longer mixing with the original one, then its ratios can change. Its gene pool over time, its average genes, its average alleles can change in comparison to the original one. As long as they're still mixing, that's difficult to do. But once they become isolated, they become separated, then one group can evolve in a separate direction from the other one, especially if they're isolated in the circumstances one way or another are different. And it turns out there's a bunch of different ways to isolate groups. It's all reproductive isolation, but I'm just going to write these down. The first cartoon is involved with geographic isolation. Okay, I'm going to squeeze these all in here, so I'm going to make a second column. You should not make a second column because you're going to want to write out the definitions of these things. Okay, so I'm going to go down the list here. In geographic isolation, you have a population across a plain with a river down the middle of it. And one reason or another, flooding, whatever, the river gets wider or deeper, or something changes in the river where members on this side can no longer get to members on that side. What had been a shared gene pool now becomes an isolated gene pool. And it could be a river, it could be a desert, it could be a mountain range, it could be the continents do drift around, is that Europe and North America are moving away from one another about as fast as your fingernails grow. So over millions and millions of years, that adds up to a pretty decent distance. At one point, we're all connected to one another. In fact, our little mountain range here dates back a really, really long time. And if you were to run the original course, it would go up across Nova Scotia and across Newfoundland, wind up in Norway, go up around Norway and down through the Alps and wind up in Morocco. If you know geography, that's a pretty weird course. And a lot of those continents used to be connected, so it was all one mountain range. Now they're separated out. But this is a type of long scale geographic isolation. Anything in the environment that causes a physical geographic barrier causes geographic isolation. In the same place, you can have a subgroup that becomes more specialized for a different job. Remember niches? A niche is a role within an ecosystem. And as they get more specialized, then for one reason or another, and I'll be right back, I just noticed my refrigerator's open. Don't know how that happened. Oh, I got something out for the lab. So say you've got a big group of hawk-like predatory birds. And in this big group, there's a small subgroup that has some decent ability to see in low light levels. So they are more active at dusk and dawn than the overall population. And so when they're active, they're more likely to run into one another, they're more likely to mate with the ones they're running into. And so they're combining these abilities and becoming more and more specialized as darkness hunters. Their eyesight, combination of here's good low light level eyesight for one reason, here's good low level eyesight for another allele, put them together, oh wow, it's even better. Is that here's the ability in low light to sneak up on prey, they can't hear you flying because the feathers are fuzzier. Is that all sorts of different features could be combined and you could produce a population that becomes more and more specialized for less and less light. Where you started with a group that were essentially hawks, and over time you wind up with a separate group reproducing in and on their own because they're reproducing at different times of day. And eventually you have owls that don't just work dusk and dawn, they work the middle of the night because they become very, very specialized for darkness. And there's a whole bunch of features that go with that. And their gene pools are now isolated. We don't even consider them the same genus anymore. Temporal isolation is that day before yesterday I was going to go get the mail and I stepped over some poor dandelion. Now, it's November. Weird time for the dandelions to be open, but that happens with plants especially where they'll get some sort of genetic change and they will flower at a time they're normally not supposed to flower. Now, since a lot of plants can reproduce by themselves, if they can manage to succeed as flowering at that different time, temporal meaning time, temporal is reproducing at a time that doesn't match the rest of the gene pool. And so you wind up reproductively isolated immediately because you're not reproducing at the same time. Now, of course, I don't think that dandelion is going to do too well. It's probably its seeds are not going to be able to get settled and be able to do what they need to do before there's snow on everything. But maybe if it had reproduced in September, it would have been able to do that. Animals, you see the same thing. Sometimes they shift in reproductive periods. Since animal reproductive periods are more related to seasons and food availability, you don't see as much of it in animals as you do in plants. Also, the plant's ability, flowers to reproduce by themselves, it's still sexual, but it still combines alleles and produces a varied gene pool. So plants are more likely to do this kind of temporal stuff. Mechanical is weirder and probably only connected to the fact that some people are bug collectors and anybody who collects bugs really wants to be able to name species. And they have this whole network where they write stuff up And if you find something that is different enough that the other guys in your group go, yeah, okay, that's worth calling a new species, you get to name it. That's why there's more species of beetles than any other type of animal. It's because it's on paper there's more species. There's a lot of beetles, but well, it turns out that people sampling beetles from the same hill have occasionally discovered, when they look very, very closely, because you can look really closely if you're trying to come up with a new species on things that aren't really all that different. They found that on one hillside, there was a subgroup of beetles whose penis and vaginas worked a particular way, in another group where it worked a different way, where they couldn't mate with each other. And so they were mechanically isolated. These two gene pools, because of their build, their mechanics, could not reproduce with each other. And so they were isolated. There was really no other major difference that you could come up with. But that, because of this process, that was enough for people to go, yeah, okay, they're a different species. Oh, I put mechanical down twice, sorry. I was going to the second column, confused me. That one up there is supposed to be behavioral. Remember how sexual selection, people want it to be about mate selection, but it really is about anything that gives you a reproductive advantage? Well, it's not like mate selection is not a big deal in certain types of reproduction for certain types of animals. And what you find on, this happens on islands sometimes, where you get these subgroups of birds where birds have these elaborate types of reproductive behaviors. They can afford to waste time with it because it's really hard to catch them and kill them. So they can, do all sorts of dances and be all sorts of fancy and stuff. And then when the predators go pounce, they go poof, and they're gone. So you can find like groups of birds of paradise that are separate species, and one of the major things that are different is how they behave in mate choice, where females like one sort of present or one sort of bower or one sort of place to lay eggs or one sort of dance, and other subgroups want like something else. And they've separated out. They don't cross with each other because they don't like each other's behavior. And then this last one is sometimes sperm and egg cells don't get along for chemical or immunological reasons, or in order for pollen to get to where the sperm and pollen to get to where the egg cells are, there's a chemical interaction between the pollen grain and the flower that gets the sperm to the egg cell. Well, if that chemical interaction doesn't work, then reproduction isn't going to happen. In some animals, the chemicals in semen may be rejected immunologically. There may be an inflammatory reaction so that the sperm can't get where they need to get. And so you can wind up with subgroups that just cannot, again, reproduce with one another. And so they become reproductively isolated, and the groups can then, the gene pools can change in those separated groups over time to the point where you get, recognizably different groups. There was a British guy whose hobby was bird watching, and every summer he would take a month and go to a rookery where a bunch of seabirds mated and formed built nests and fed their young and did all that stuff. And he kept notes so that when he went in the summertime and he saw a bird, making a nest, that bird, he knew their ancestry. He knew their parents and their grandparents because he recognized them for a couple of different reasons. One day on a particularly rainy summer, he was trapped indoors and he decided, I'm gonna do a big family tree for these guys. And it wasn't until he did this that he found out he had two family trees that never crossed with one another. There were two isolated breeding communities on this one rookery. And until he did the family trees, he couldn't tell you what the differences were between them. And he still couldn't. They apparently knew how to tell each other apart. But what was that going to do 15, 20 generations down the road? Would they become recognizably different to humans because they were separate gene pools? There's what they call genetic drift, where mutations that happen in one group don't happen in the other group. And so changes in alleles happen over here that don't happen over there. And that alone can produce differences even in two groups that are in the same place doing the same thing, like those beetles. But it's sometimes the differences are very subtle. Okay, that's a good place to stop.